joining today's talk on equity, opportunity, and advancing America's competitive edge through the responsible use of AI. My name is Gladys Pettis-Severson. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Management Programs at the Heinz College. I'd like to take a moment to recognize my partner in crime, Justin Deo, who I don't see here, but he is the Program Manager for Responsible AI at the Black Center for Technology and Society, and he was instrumental in planning this event. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. A summer internship for Vice President Gore as an undergraduate student in Michigan sparked his interest in policy and technology. Since then, he has spent 20 years working in technology at the crossroads of business, government, and nonprofit sector. He is the CEO of Benefits Data Trust, a nonprofit that uses data, technology, policy change, and direct service to help people tap unclaimed benefits that support critical needs such as food security and health care. Before joining BDT, he was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow and worked on social and economic implications of the global rise of artificial intelligence. For 8 years, he ran a strategic advisory practice to financial technology startups, philanthropic initiatives, and business leaders. He's also held White House policy staff positions during 2 administrations. He currently serves on the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee alongside our Dean Krishnan, which advises the President and the National AI Initiative Office on issues related to artificial intelligence. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, holds a Master of Science in Regulation from the London School of Economics, as well as a Master of Law from the University of London. Without further ado, Trooper Sanders.
I think the abstract of that introduction is that I'm very old. So, it's really great to be at Carnegie Mellon. Number one, the first time I ever heard of Carnegie Mellon was when I was in high school, and a very good friend, we were talking about the colleges we were applying to, and she said, "I think I'm going to live in Pittsburgh." And I mean, okay, I'm from Detroit, and so you have to be careful about casting aspersions on other cities. But I was like, "Why would you want to go to Pittsburgh?" And she said, "I'm going to study art at Carnegie Mellon." So interestingly, my first thinking about Carnegie Mellon was in the arts, as opposed to engineering and policy and other areas. But I'm also really excited, truly, I'm like giddy, if you can be giddy about these matters, that Carnegie Mellon has a genuine, baked-in, interdisciplinary approach to matters of artificial intelligence, technology, society, policy, across the other domains. And if there is one thing that we have to get right when we think about AI and the United States and the world, is this intersection of disciplines. What I like to think of is how do we meld the worlds of code and prose. And I can remember actually I sort of fell into this when I was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow, and I'll just say that in my college and graduate school, I was very much on the social science qualitative side of the campus. Let's just put it that way. And so, as I was beginning to get my head around AI and everything, I don't know, maybe it's that, I went to one of the big AI heavy technical academic conferences that was actually it was in New Orleans, this one. And the first 2 days, I had absolutely no idea what was going on at all. And I was like, okay, political economy major, this is why you should be careful coming into the big engineering conference. But then around the end of day 2, you start picking up patterns, picking up different themes, and then part of the conversations were around, well, what are going to be the broader implications of this for society? And there were a couple of folks who were great, who were brilliant, but then I was like, well, no, that's off. That's not actually how this particular system works, or how policy works, or how particular communities are affected. So I was like, all right, you have something to contribute, an original contribution. And then, as probably is the case, by day 3, I was like, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. So we're all just figuring this stuff out. And so I think this interdisciplinary approach that Carnegie Mellon has is really grounded in that. And yes, a lot of smart folks, a lot of hardworking folks, but we're all just figuring this out from all the different angles. So a conversation around competitiveness, opportunity, and equity, and for the United States. I come here knowing that is both a topic du jour and also something that has a very well-covered literature. There's a broad conversation around how does the United States stay at the cutting edge of research and development, and how do we really do this? And I would commend to you the recent National Artificial Intelligence Research Resource Task Force that just published a really, really helpful report on recommendations about how the United States government should be framing issues around innovation and talent and diversity, and how do we expand our capacity, and of course, how do we have trustworthy AI. And then of course, there is a vast and really interesting community of people, of scholars and practitioners who have really advanced the conversations around the risk and potential harms of AI, and being on campus. I don't want to get an academic violation and get called before Krish for a completely different reason. So let me just, for the sake of it, some of the thinkers and scholars who've really helped inform my thinking, folks like Kathy O'Neill and Doctors Timnit Gebru, who's brilliant, Karen Levy, Alondra Nelson, and so many more. And then, of course, folks who are in industry or government have a lot to say about this. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of opportunity. And also, if you think about government, and particularly in areas around defense and national security, there is a whole very contentious but very important conversation about what is the role of AI in those parts of our society. So I want to recognize all of that in the state of the art. And I'm really here, and while I'm going to express some personal opinions, I should just say, but I'm really here to talk about this in the context of the third sector, of the nonprofit sector, of that spans human services and social services, and how does the work that my extraordinary colleagues at Benefits Data Trust, how does that work intersect with the big topics that you're studying and that we are grappling with? So let me just start with the origin story of BDT, of Benefits Data Trust. We're founded back in 2005 by a really interesting entrepreneur, Warren Cantor, who grew up a blue-collar kid from Philadelphia, and made his way through school and figured out how to study and work and pay bills and all those other things. He did really well for himself in business and became involved in aging advocacy, as a sort of a business leader in the community. And then a couple of things happened. One, in his own personal life at the time, his mother was aging, and he was trying to help her apply for benefits that people are eligible for. And this is a pretty smart room. We've got all sorts of degrees, and you can like make a computer smoke. I will defy anyone here to go and try to fill out a SNAP application. Bring your tissue and comfort animal and whatever you need, because I am telling you, it will bring you to your knees of the complexity that goes into this. And so Warren's like, well, wait a minute. I've done gazillion-dollar deals. I'm a big deal in business. Why is this stumping me? And then around the same time, some of you all may know that in the state of Pennsylvania, the state lottery system, the revenue from that, In many states, it goes towards education. In Pennsylvania, it goes towards a prescription drug assistance program for senior citizens. So it's a pretty stable funding base. And at the time, they were having an extraordinary time getting seniors signed up for this program. And as anyone who's had to intersect with the American healthcare system, you know that prescription drugs is a budget buster, particularly if you are a senior. And so a public servant, Tom Sneddon, who is probably one of the most extraordinary public servants I've ever met, he is around 80, plus or minus a year or two, runs 5 to 7 miles every morning, and is like on the ball and has been making this prescription drug assistance program work, and has been working for the state of Pennsylvania since the 80s. So Tom and Warren connected, and Warren asked a very basic question. Well, wait a minute. So you're trying to get prescription drug assistance to poor senior citizens. Well, what would you do if they were rich people? By the way, rich people get help with a whole lot of stuff. They have, frankly, in some cases, may have more issues than many of us. And it's pretty easy to get help. And the systems treat you well. They respect your time. They make sure it's as easy as possible. So Warren said, look, if we were trying to sell a financial product to rich people, we would get some good, polite people to treat them well and talk to them. At the time, in 2005, we would send them a letter and advertise a bit and figure out, test like, well, what language and message works and what color of the paper and the envelope and all of that's most appealing. And then we would provide an effective service. That's how people build successful businesses all the time. Why don't we try some of those same techniques when we're talking about low-income people? And so that's where BDT got its start, through a list, the mail, and having some extraordinary people on the other end of the phone who could help you out. And then from that, we have grown into starting in Philadelphia, working across Pennsylvania. Today, BDT works across the country in more than a dozen states. We work very closely in healthcare, increasingly in higher education. I'll talk a bit about that later. Health insurance organizations such as UPMC, that's founded right here, based right here in Pittsburgh. And one of the key parts in our secret sauce is data matching. And it's simple in concept, very complicated in execution. And going back to those early days, once we sort of moved a few steps forward, it was saying, well, no, wait a minute. There are a lot of benefits. There's some of the federal benefits, SNAP, or what used to be called food stamps, WIC for moms and young children, Medicaid, federal financial aid. The latest is the Affordable Connectivity Program for broadband. All of these benefits, that's just at the federal level. And one of our approaches is data matching between two major benefits, Medicaid and SNAP. And chances are, if you're on Medicaid and you qualify for healthcare assistance for low-income people, chances are you are eligible for SNAP. But today we have 9 million people across the country who are eligible for SNAP but are not receiving it. We have 7 million people who are eligible for Medicaid but not receiving it. And so our basic approach is working with a state, getting their agencies to work together to develop data sharing agreements between those two entities, which can be quite challenging because in government there are lots of silos, there are lots of entrenched practices, and so it takes a lot to get them working together. And we ask them, take your Medicaid list, compare it against your SNAP list, and then give us the people who are receiving healthcare assistance but not the nutrition assistance. And then that begins our outreach process. Good old-fashioned mail works. We actually get a higher response rate than most, but also texting and other techniques are important. And again, testing the messaging, who should it come from? Sometimes it's something signed by the governor because they may be more trusted. In other cases, it could be a local community leader because they're trusted. And they call through to my colleagues, and who really do more than just like run through what's your income, how many kids do you have, et cetera. But really grounded in this is the human experience, is dignity, and is treating people in a way that is in a pretty stressful circumstance where you not only need help, but you need to call someone you don't know to navigate through that system. And I'll never forget, on our organization Slack channel, we sometimes will get positive feedback from our clients, sometimes constructive, you have to take it all, but we like to celebrate the positive feedback. And I remember it was during the pandemic, one of the clients said, I don't even think she was eligible for benefit, but said, wow, your colleague spoke to me like she actually wanted to listen to me and to be here. And that doesn't happen. And I think one of the hard truths in the United States today is being treated with dignity and respect and kindness is privilege. It's not something that is frankly the mainstream. And so amidst all the other things that we're going to do that I'll talk about, that keeping the individual at the center of things, keeping that dignified experience is essential. So for BDT, today we have about $80 billion worth of benefits programs across healthcare, education, broadband, et cetera, that people are eligible for but are not receiving. Those of you who are involved in policy issues or advocacy things in your own life, you know, if we had $80 billion here and had a social problem, we could probably show each other a good time. But we put that to waste in the United States every year. And as you know, we're kind of in a robust political climate. That $80 billion is post-politics. We've already done the hard politics. Now, what keeps people from tapping it? As I said, the applications are hard. It takes a lot of time. For some benefits, you still have to drag your child to an office and prove that you're a mom. If you're under stress, under strain, you have too many things that you need to do. And so I fundamentally believe that not only is the work that Benefits Data Trust is doing worthy from a mission-driven point of view, we should see the $80 billion that we're trying to put to work as public service capital to drive progress in the United States against some of the major issues that we're facing. And let's just think about three key drivers: aging, climate change, and diversity. And think about, how does helping someone apply for SNAP to buy a better bag of groceries relate to those big drivers? So today, about 1 in 6 Americans are 65 years or older, and we are reaching a point that by the middle of the next decade, there are going to be more older Americans, if I'm around, hopefully I'll be one of them, than children. And this presents, I think, a lot of opportunities for the country, and frankly, we're in a world that's aging as well, but also some challenges. You know, as you may know, as you age, you need more help. You need more health care. You need other things, and it's very expensive. And one of the major pressures on our federal budget, on state budgets, on county budgets, is the cost of health care and other support for older residents. And we do work to help those seniors get SNAP, doing the data matching, et cetera. And we did a couple professors did a study that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine that looked at the impact of enrolling older residents in North Carolina into SNAP. And we found that by getting them a better bag of groceries, again, for for the policy folks here, there's a whole debate on whether it's the ideal bag of groceries for what the benefit allows, but a better bag of groceries, that it could save the taxpayers about $2,300 a year per person. Now, why is that? If you eat better, have better nutrition, you're going to be in better shape. That's not rocket science. But what we also found is that it would reduce, if someone got sick, the number of days they went into the hospital and had to stay. And then the other part is it could meaningfully delay when they might need to leave their home and go into a nursing home or care center. And from a pure business point of view, long-term care in the United States is going to break the bank. And to think, we have a choice. A couple $100 a month to help somebody buy groceries. We're spending tens of thousands of dollars a month so that someone can be in long-term care before they may necessarily need to be there. And one of the things during the pandemic that really struck me is that, as you may remember, is that it was nursing homes and care homes that were one of the epicenters of COVID fatalities. And putting the dollars and cents aside, to think if we had solved the benefits access gap around SNAP for seniors back in 2018, 2019, marshaling a lot of the power of AI and analytics and other things to make sure that every senior eligible for SNAP got it, there possibly could have been a meaningful number of seniors who were not in nursing homes, who did not have to succumb, who went through, in the early days of the pandemic. I think it was really hard to control young children and older grandparents and great-grandparents, because they're like, I've been through 3 wars and this, that, and the other. I'm not going to let some bug keep me from my daily, coffee hour with my friends. It's like, well, okay, so we could have done that, and that systemically vital impact is what drives BDT and us trying to solve this $80 billion gap. Climate change. As we know, it's here. It is biting down, globally and nationally. And we know that traditionally marginalized and underserved communities are going to be bitten harder by climate change. The health effects that weather is going to bring, if you have asthma and other health effects, the changing climate is going to affect it. If you work outside, if you're a laborer and you work outside, or you take public transportation and it takes you hours to get to work, and in lower income areas, there isn't enough shade cover. There will be more and more days where it will be too hot for you to work or to get to work. And that is going to hammer your earnings. And then, of course, as we've seen from most recently this awful tornado in Mississippi, if you being affected, your property being affected by weather events is hard enough. It's even more when that's the only thing you have in the world. You can't move. This is what's really going to hit people. It's going to disproportionately affect the poor. It's going to disproportionately affect communities of color. And in fact, this year, in just the economic report of the president, in the climate change section, it talked about how Medicare and Medicaid is going to be affected from a budget point of view from climate change. So if we go back to my data matching of Medicaid and SNAP, we can put that into service of climate resiliency and addressing climate change by taking all the extraordinary data work that's going on to analyze which communities are going to be affected by climate change and all the different modeling that's going on, and integrate the social issues, benefits access data, and potentially really make this $80 billion, put it to work as our country is adapting to climate change, as we're building in these strategies. And for those of you who are involved in climate work, you know that some of the ideas out there are, goodness, can we appeal to Harrisburg to create a $10 million climate resiliency program? Or can we do something at the federal level? Or can we get a foundation to give a little grant? Meanwhile, we have billions of dollars over here that can at least make sure that people have the health care, have the other support, so that as things take effect, it may bite a little bit less. And then diversity. I mean, we are and are becoming ever more a wonderfully diverse country across all sorts of issues. But look, we have some challenges. We have history to confront around exclusion and inequities. And if we are going to realize the best of what our diversity can bring, and just being a really interesting and dynamic country that contributes to the world, we are going to have to address some of these fundamental issues. And so again, going back to that $80 billion, one of the hard truths is that while there's a natural bureaucracy and complexity that goes into any program, any faculty meeting here is probably a complex affair, I would imagine. So that's understandable. But it's also important to recognize that when we were creating the social safety net in the United States, that frankly, it was built into the DNA to exclude some people, to make it harder for some people. We've also have this fear what I would say is a slightly over-caffeinated fear about fraud. And that somehow there are these like marauding masses of poor people who are just wanting to steal the taxpayers' money. Now, integrity is important. If you're not eligible, you shouldn't get the benefit. That's pretty straightforward. But what we have done is we have erected a system that is so focused on that it deters and deflects people who are eligible. I mean, it would be like if, coming into your academic buildings, if you not only have to scan your card or show your ID or whatever it is you have to do for common sense security, but if you were turned upside down every day, if there were barriers to get to your classroom that should be just a 2-minute walk and it took you 20 minutes, and oh, by the way, why don't you fill in a couple forms every week just to are you sure you're a student here? Bring your admissions letter or email. Because, I don't know, you could be anybody. You could be a little sketchy. Imagine if we did that and what it would do to your experience as a student in getting your degree. That's what we do to low-income people all the time. And a lot of that is grounded in some of our legacies around race and diversity. But now on the positive side, imagine, so we know to create a more equitable system, we're going to have to recognize different communities and how to respond. Imagine what we could do with the treasure trove of data that we have representing the diversity of our country to make these programs not only more efficient, but more dignified and more targeted, so that the type of reforms that we need actually serve people the way they want to be served, and in ways that are recognizable and relevant to how they live their lives and the cultural context where they live their lives. And I'm fortunate to have a very diverse team, and as we are doing our work, and of course, you're trying to serve the country, so there are certain shortcuts that you have to make, but I'm always fascinated that inevitably a colleague who may come from a particular community will say, those letters we send out doesn't work in my community, or this language or that language. Actually, the trusted person is someone else, and so we're going to have to get around them. They're the gatekeeper. So we need to bring the diversity and the data from diversity into advancing a stronger social safety net. But now, of course, all of that, I can be enthusiastic about how AI and data and all the smart people like you in this room can solve this $80 billion challenge. However, we know that this comes with certain risks and challenges. And of course, there's issues around bias and other things. But I think one of the things that we need to really think through is getting the right balance between the rigor of the science and the complexity of how society works. And so when I'm talking to my data scientists and engineering colleagues and come up with some harebrained scheme or idea, and part of being CEO is you just get to be kind of annoying and have a creative idea week even if it doesn't work. And I'll come with some grand thing, and what will they ask? Well, what are you trying to solve for? And I'm like, oh, you don't know the exact thing I'm trying to solve for yet. But I need you to be part of the messy conversation of the big amorphous problem. And so I think one of the challenges in this discipline and in the field is not to jump for what are we solving for. Because if you take the benefits work, we could say we're going to solve for uptake, benefits uptake. What is many people who are eligible to get the benefits. Great. But what that might not do is deal with the dignified experience. And so people who feel that they've been run around and hurt and disrespected throughout their life, and they're like, what I don't need is one more disrespectful, embarrassing encounter. I'm not going to engage you. I don't trust you yet. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be embarrassed. But if we're solving just for uptake, what we could do is better serve folks who are frankly more easier to serve in general. Now, when you're talking about low and moderate income people, that's a good thing. But if you're putting this work in the context of equity, if you're putting it in the context of really trying to make sure the hardest to serve are being served with precision, that's the wrong question. Now, we could say, well, we are trying to provide the most dignified experience. Now, I can hear some of my quantitative colleagues going, what the heck does that even mean? And then I can hear my social science colleagues being like, well, let me give you a 2-hour talk on what dignity can mean from all sorts of theoretical perspectives. And I think in terms of the questions, not just for benefits access, but in general about how are we going to deploy these amazing technologies and capabilities, we're going to have to spend a little bit more time wrestling with the context, with the history, with the politics, before we even get to the goal, get to the question we're trying to solve. Because in my space, there's an open question of do we even want everyone who's eligible to get benefits? There's an open political question of do we want all communities to have access? And there's ample research in the literature that, generally speaking, to the extent there are positive feelings about a social safety net, it changes if suddenly you bring race into it or you bring region into it. So that's a part of before we get to the question of what we have to deal with. And then the other part is, of course, look, BDT should not exist. If government worked for poor people the way that it should, you wouldn't need a benefits data trust. And frankly, that's our goal, is to be able to serve as many people today and affect the systemic change and progress that we need so that one day the system just works. And while I think there's an extraordinary role for AI in government reform, in government improvements, I do think we need to have a hard conversation about, is it replacing or is it augmenting? And there's a general conversation around, well, oh my goodness, is the robot apocalypse going to happen and take all of our jobs? Well, the indicators right now are like, there's not really the robot apocalypse. It is changing the nature of some jobs and roles. And so one of the things as we think about artificial intelligence and government and public services is to really ask a fundamental question of where do we value public service? Where do we value public servants? Because approaching AI from the perspective of, ugh, it's government. Oh, it's just all those government workers just, spending our money, not doing anything. You could have a wrecking ball of AI come through. And it'll do some work, but you will hollow out the infrastructure. But if you approach it from the point of view that most people get up every day trying to do the right thing, most people get up every day trying to make these complicated systems work, and particularly if you're in government or public service, no one is getting rich. So generally speaking, you don't have 50 years worth of student loan payments to just do awful things. Then there's a conversation of, well, how is AI going to be of service and a partner to public servants? And this is a live issue. So there's a court case out of Michigan that was recently settled in the past month, and the opinion, it could be worth looking up, where about a decade ago, Michigan automated some of the verification and fraud detection for the unemployment compensation system. And my understanding is that they basically put all the government workers out of work, automated it, went through the applications, and frankly, the algorithm was just bad and wrong. And so it pulled out a significant number of people and said, fraud, fraud, fraud. The system spat out a form letter to them saying, hey, we think you might have claimed benefits you were not entitled to. And there was something in there around the timing. Send it through the mail. Now, how many people check their mail every day? Oh, be proud. Generationally, some of us do. But a lot of people. And it essentially said, if you do not respond within a set time, we will assume that you are guilty. So imagine if you were on unemployment for a few weeks or a few months, years ago, you're living your life, you may have moved. Suddenly people go to apply for a job or rent an apartment, and there's a flag. that caused real harm. People lost their jobs, they lost their homes, there was other forms of harm. And so as part of this, and this lawsuit took years to get through the system, but one of the things that was in the opinion was the court said there needs to be a heightened scrutiny and responsibility if you are bringing an algorithm and automation to a process like this. So considering how do we fuse the worlds of code and prose and people together is important. Third part is I know there's a whole debate, and my Twitter's so nerdy. Like, I didn't know pop culture, but I have all the sort of like AI scholars and people who like fight, and it's sort of fascinating. But there's a whole debate right now of does generative AI, does this represent general intelligence? Does this represent, oh, we don't need humans anymore? And some say, oh my goodness, like the glory, the promised land is here. Others are like, it's just math, like what are you talking about? And I would actually like to introduce a third part. From a practical point of view, from a societal impact point of view, it actually doesn't matter. Because particularly, I think what we've seen in the past, I mean, it matters to sort of get it accurately, but what it doesn't matter is that what matters is what people and what customers of these tools and techniques think it does. And so if you suddenly are looking at putting all your queries into ChatGPT and having a good old time, and you think, oh my gosh, this is smarter than I am, or certainly smarter than whomever I would ask a question, and you happen to be an assistant secretary at a social service, you're like, oh, no, wait a minute. I'm underwater. There are tens of thousands of people I can't serve today. I have a retirement and resignation crisis that will likely not abate for the next several years. And you're telling me, like, I could just use this and do a few things? I'm going to call my people and say, let's get it done tomorrow. And they're going to move faster than the debate will allow to catch up. So I think this issue of public perception and public branding is something for this community to really, really think about. Now, for places like Carnegie Mellon, this third area around our competitiveness. So going back to America's place in the world, if we can figure out how to make our social safety net work, maximize those dollars as investment capital in our people and the social progress that we can make, that's going to position the U.S. to be a pretty strong and successful country going ahead. A lot of big ifs around that. But of course, one of the final areas is the talent race. You are part of the talent race. There are lots of folks out there putting big bets and staying up at night hoping that you get through Carnegie Mellon and walk across that. Do you walk across the stage or you just stand up and sit down? Is it one of the schools? Michigan didn't care. There were too many graduates. It was like stand up and sit down, which really annoys parents because they're like, I wrote all those checks to just have you stand up and sit down. But there's a lot riding on that. You want, got it. There's a lot riding on your degree and on your brains, and not just you, not just master's students and doctoral students, but folks who are doing advanced manufacturing and other programs at two-year community colleges, and others, the vast panoply of roles that we need. And we have a talent shortage. Look, I have a talent shortage in my organization, and people are panicked that we are simply not going to have the number of people with the skills and with the resilience that we're going to need to keep this economy going. Now, who are we talking about? So I was fortunate enough to go to a great mixture of Detroit public and private schools. If anyone's seen the old movie 8 Mile with Eminem, I went to the high school that his rival went to, that he torched at the end of the movie. That was my school. I went to Cranbrook, that's a private school. So, then I went to University of Michigan and all these other things. The future of America is not built on younger people like me who kind of go through the treadmill. Who we're really talking about are folks who have been excluded outside of that track of opportunity. And so the future of the American economy and our competitiveness and having enough people across the different sectors are folks who are eligible for benefits, or maybe 1 or 2 steps away from qualifying for SNAP and Medicaid and Medicare and other things. And that's both children and young people, but it's also for older people. It's the parent in their 30s and 40s who, if you live in Kent County, Michigan, you are hoping that she can convert and get her registered nursing degree to keep that hospital open. So how do you help someone who has kids and aging parents and all the things of life get through a nursing degree? And oh, by the way, if you're 18, you might do a full-time. If you're in your 30s and 40s, you're probably doing part-time. How do we ensure that someone can spend up to a decade getting the critical degrees and certifications? We need to go back to making the most out of our social safety net. And we can make the case by through a lot of the advanced analytics of not only how to serve them, but what's going to have the biggest bang for the buck. So if you're developing your healthcare workforce strategy in a county, or if you're doing advanced manufacturing, or whatever it may be, I would love to be able to do the analytics that says, like, here's the business case I can make for you. You may not even care about government. You may not want government to exist. But I can make the business case to you of here's how you're going to get 500 more nurses out of your state by making sure that they have access to the support that they need. So today we have 2 million college students who are eligible for SNAP but not receiving it. Your classmates, could be some of you, and in other schools around the country, we're trying to study, trying to crack all the, you know, what's the organic chemistry of engineering and policy that kind of like really grabs people. But how do you do that when you're hungry and when you're scared about being hungry tomorrow? And I think we have $3 billion worth of SNAP on the table that we could be applying to making sure that your classmates and other schools around the country can keep the students so that they can focus and get the degrees that we need them to have. We have 6 million Pell Grant eligible students who are not getting the Affordable Connectivity Program, who are trying to pay their bills to be able to, you know, have internet connection. There's billions of dollars sitting right there. We have to do a better job of perfecting this. And it's not just going to come from letters and people. It's going to have to be coming from the responsible application of these advanced tools and techniques. And then there's another group that I want to talk about that's a little bit more uncomfortable. It's the affluent. Folks who have good jobs and, you know, the folks who were worried during the pandemic that they weren't suffering, and so there was like, you know, a bit of a literature around, well, should you feel guilty because nothing's going wrong in your life? And frankly, I told them, I'm like, we're going to stop that cold because there's so much suffering going on. If you're having an issue because you're not suffering, go help somebody. Or you know what, enjoy your life today and like show somebody what joy looks like. Like we all kind of needed that bit of therapy. But for folks who are doing affluent, who are affluent and doing really well, here's the dirty little secret. I can guarantee you that many have a mother, a father, a grandparent, an elderly relative on Medicare, on SNAP. They have a sibling or a child with severe disabilities, and the only way they can afford to get that care is through Medicaid. And as part of the social safety net conversation in the United States, we don't talk about 6-figure, 7-figure folks being recipients and beneficiaries. Because when mom or dad has the Medicare and Medicaid and SNAP and other things that they need, what does that mean? They can live their life. They can write the check to Carnegie Mellon, right? Because you don't have to send a check to mom and dad to eat. That's also fueling our progress. And I think having a more community approach to making these systems work, it helps all of us. So finally, just a few quick things. As you're thinking about this work, and again, I'm just so excited that there are so many interdisciplinary folks here. One, think about how do you fuse the world of code and prose. And I think in general, we all need to learn how to like reach across our different disciplines because we all come with a certain way of thinking and a mode of how we've been trained. But then suddenly you're in a room with others and it's like, ooh, okay, what on earth are you talking about? And I'll, you know, as a social science grad, I will just put an additional challenge out to the quantitative computer scientists and data scientists and others. It can be really intimidating if you do not come from a rigorous quantitative background to sit around the table with folks who do, particularly when you're talking about artificial intelligence, particularly when you're talking about things around data. Now, there's a lot that other disciplines, as you know, bring to bear. Frankly, all that bias and all the things that come from the enormous, that's just history and sociology and anthropology. Frankly, if I were going to do something really radical with AI, probably one of the first folks I want in the room, give me a sociologist and anthropologist to give me the grounding of what is reflected in the data set. But I think one of the interesting things about how you're approaching this is yes, all the learnings that you're doing, but how to have that conversation and how to invite others from different disciplines into the conversation. And how do you, frankly, feel uncomfortable when you're sitting around the table with a bunch of sociologists and political scientists and you're like, what on earth are they talking about? That's good, because that's sharpening some of the skills that we all need. Second, we need to think about there is a question of whether we should use AI. There's definitely a question there. And in some cases, we shouldn't. But we also need to think about, are organizations and institutions ready to use it responsibly? And that goes beyond data sets and analytical staff. That goes into, are the management systems in place? Are frontline workers and folks who really have the domain expertise? That could be the frontline nurse if you're in a healthcare setting. In my case, it's our benefits outreach specialists. Are they at the table to bring a perspective of reality to how you're deploying some of these techniques? Third part is there's going to be a lot of money to be made around it. I mean, there's a lot of money being made right now, but let's just be honest. There's a lot more that's going to be made. And if we think about government and the benefit system, government is going to have to go through a digital transition. It is going to be hard and long and a lot of ups and downs. One of the things I think we need to do is how can we help government leaders be smarter customers of AI? And that's not just the procurement folks who are just trying to crank through the contracts. And it won't necessarily be the chief technology officers and information officers. It could be an assistant secretary who's just like trying to crank through the day, and they need those 2 or 3 smart questions or perspectives to ask. So how do we equip? And then finally, I think that AI is fundamentally political. If AI is built off of data, and data is a reflection of our life and our history, it's fundamentally political. And so part of that question that you're trying to solve for, it's a political question. Do we want a country? Do we want a world that is more equitable, that is more fair, where people, no matter their circumstances, are treated with dignity and respect? Those are hard questions to come to a marketplace consensus around. But that's an important part of the work, so that when you get the task of the question that you're trying to solve for, the answer actually does the greatest good. Thank you for having me. A couple minutes for questions?
About 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah. Or violent disagreements with what I said. I'm totally fine with that too. Yes?
In the case of Michigan, they sort of have a sour taste in their mouth dealing with automated systems due to this recent case. How would you sort of approach Michigan legislature and sort of, I don't know, allow them to welcome back in AI and teach them about more your approach to automating systems in government?
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is Michigan is, I mean, we, for disclosure, we do a lot of work in Michigan. And they have a really energetic group of leaders who are really trying to do the hard work to make these systems work better and work more effectively. You know, I think there are a few things. I think one is, how do you take that litigation, that case, and that experience as a cautionary tale that sort of sharpens and concentrates the mind, and that says, like, look, if you just, frankly, just think you're going to sprinkle some AI pixie dust on things and magic is going to happen, it can be some devastating effects. I think practically, the interesting exercise, and I don't know, maybe Carnegie Mellon can, I should probably say, work with some fellow folks at the University of Michigan. But I think taking that litigation and saying like, okay, from an organizational context and institutional context, what lessons should we draw? And literally go back and look at the procurement paper trail and the contracting paper trail. Say, how should we redesign that to avoid this circumstance? Both in wording the contract, because I think there's a really big question around, well, how did you just, it takes years to get things through procurement. How did you let a really stupid algorithm just get through that was just a jalopy of a system? But then it's thinking about, okay, once you deploy, how do we build institutions so that, from the defense sector, it's called, how do you keep the humans in the loop? And from the legislature's perspective, maybe it's saying like, well, wait a minute. If you're suddenly hearing like, hey, you can get rid of a bunch of public servants by automating something that's pretty high stakes, that should be a red flag. Because nothing's that simple. And so I think potentially Michigan and other states can really use it as an instructive device. Another question. Yeah.
Question. So you mentioned trying to find a seat at the table with people who are working on AI. Struggled with that a little bit as someone who's not in computer science. How would you recommend to get a seat at the table?
Oh, there are a few things. I mean, if I think back, my answer was like, probably for a while just being really comfortable, feeling really dumb. And just let it wash over you for a while, and then some pattern recognition comes in. But I think the other part is assuming, sometimes it's just barging in and just sitting down, frankly. But then I do think it's being confident and grounded in what your expertise actually is. So if you're a sociologist, if you're a history scholar, if you're a literature scholar, you come with a toolbox and a perspective. And given the range of things that anything touching AI is going to have to deal with, even if, how to get comfortable of just introducing it and being in there. I love the work of Karen Levy, who's at Cornell, because she's a sociologist by training and has done some really interesting work on the impact of automation and AI in the trucking sector and on truckers and the impact that it has on their the sort of algorithmic management. And bringing that lens to a technical field is fascinating. A second person, she is a computer scientist, a brilliant one, but who, Joy Bulamwini, you may have heard of her. If you look up on YouTube, Ain't I a Woman AI. So Ain't I a Woman is a poem from the abolitionist Sojourner Truth. Joy, she calls herself a poet of code, took Sojourner Truth's poem, put it to the research that she and Tanik Gebru and others did on racial bias and facial recognition, where you had Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama classified as a monkey. And how she conveys this in a 90-second is just sort of brilliant. And then I think, there's always probably good to have those one or two killer questions that everybody's dealing with. I always like to ask, what's the greatest vulnerability in your data set? Because if someone says there isn't, I'm like, okay, A, you're lying. B, you don't know what you're doing, so we're now intellectual equals. So let's now proceed. Maybe one more. Yes.
So, these are students in a master's program, and they're interested in building their skills for the workforce. But the workforce is changing. We don't know what the future of work looks like. What are those salient skills that would stand the test of time, stand GPT? What are those critical skills that we should be teaching?
Yeah. So I do think, and I'm not just saying this, but I do think this ability to work across guilds, this interdisciplinary comfort, is so important. And it's not just like if you're an engineering public policy student that you master both domains. It's actually being comfortable with I'm not a computer scientist, but I've developed the muscle to engage in those settings and to bring my own. Because look, most things are so complicated. I mean, I know there's like, I'm always fascinated about this whole sort of conversation around imposter syndrome. And I always think, well, first I'm like, well, who on earth has the right to make somebody not feel welcome? Like that's a lot. But the dirty little secret is most people, even the most skilled and talented, only really know what they're doing maybe 1 out of every 4 times. That's actually the truth. Like, life is too complicated. These issues move too fast. Everybody has like parents and kids and other drama in their life that distracts them. So being comfortable in that kind of mix. Frankly, I highly, highly, highly value clear writing. Oh. I feel like an old man. I don't know what has happened in the smartphone era. But what you put on social media and how you communicate via text is not necessarily the same way you communicate in the business environment. And then I think finally the third part, and I think particularly if you're coming from communities that are not traditionally at the center of the table, is 1, value the power of your experience, and 2, don't be afraid to just sit yourself. Don't wait for the invitation, frankly. Because half time, people don't really have the spine to remove you, so you just sit out. Like we think we're like, oh, they're gonna. No, they're not. Frankly, because they're going through their own issues in their own head. So sometimes you just have to plop yourself right in the middle and just see how it works out. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Now, I learned from politics, you always make sure you both turn off the lavalier mic and remove it before you do anything else. Because then, so you don't become a meeting.